She does not walk into the restaurant. She arrives. And somewhere between the parking lot and the hostess stand, she has already decided that tonight, someone is going to disappoint her. Today, we are going to decode the psychology of Karens who think rules don't apply to them. Chapter 1. The rule is not the real problem. Picture this. A woman stands at a customer service counter in a department store. She has a blouse. The tags are gone. The receipt is from 8 months ago. The return window closed in week 2. The associate explains this calmly, kindly, with a customer service smile that has probably taken years to maintain. And the woman's face shifts. Not into frustration exactly. Into something closer to offense. Like she has been told something deeply personal, something insulting. And here is the thing you need to understand before we go any further. The return policy is not why she is upset. For this kind of person, the rule itself is rarely the actual problem. The rule is a symbol. And what that symbol says to her is something she cannot tolerate hearing. You are the same as everyone else. Think about the situations where this behavior explodes most often. A parking enforcement officer leaves a ticket on a windshield. A flight attendant asks someone to power down their device before takeoff. A restaurant host explains that the kitchen stops taking orders at 9:45. A queue of 30 people waits patiently while one person at the front has decided the line does not apply to them because they are just asking a quick question. None of these rules are targeted. None of them know her name, her history, her feelings. They are impersonal by design. And that is precisely the problem. Rules flatten everyone to the same level. They say, here, in this moment, you are a customer, a passenger, a member of the public. You are one of many. And for the person who has organized their entire emotional architecture around being exceptional, that message lands like a small grenade. The meltdown does not begin when the rule is applied. It begins the moment ordinary circumstances make them feel ordinary. Chapter 2. Entitlement as a private religion. Now, most people hear the word entitlement and think it means simply wanting special treatment. And while that is part of it, the psychological reality is far more complex and far more suffocating than that. Entitlement, at its extreme, is a worldview, a private religion with exactly one believer. The doctrine goes something like this: my inconvenience is more significant than your boundary. My frustration is proof that you have failed. My needs should automatically become your emergency, and rules, real, written, publicly posted, consistently enforced rules, are for other people. People without my circumstances, my history, my importance. Watch what happens when someone like this gets denied a refund they do not legally qualify for. They do not think, okay, fair enough, the policy is the policy. They think, this employee has chosen to treat me this way. This is personal. This is a power move against me specifically. Watch what happens when they are asked to wait in line. They do not see 30 other people who arrived first. They see an obstacle, an insult dressed up as a cue. Watch how they speak to the waiter who informs them that the item they want is no longer on the menu. Not disappointment, not acceptance, something closer to contempt. Because entitlement is not simply wanting more than you deserve. It is expecting reality, the actual physical, social, institutional world, to rearrange itself around your emotional discomfort. When it does not, it is not just inconvenient. It feels like a violation. Here is where it gets interesting. Many of these people are not consciously aware of this belief. If you sat them down and said, "Do you think rules should not apply to you?" they would be offended. They would tell you they believe in fairness. They would tell you they simply know when they are being treated wrong. And they would believe every word of it. Because entitlement this deep does not feel like arrogance from the inside. It feels like justice. Chapter 3. The hidden fear of being powerless. But here is where it gets darker. Because if you look closely at the targets this kind of person chooses, something very specific emerges. And it tells you more about what is really going on underneath the performance than anything else. They do not go to the CEO's office and demand a refund. They do not walk into the corporate headquarters and make a scene. They do not challenge people who have the actual power to push back. They go to the cashier, the server, the receptionist, the security guard at the parking structure, the airline employee at the gate, the customer service representative who makes $14 an hour and is required by their job to remain polite. Think about what that means. They do not attack the person who has the most power. They attack the person who is least allowed to fight back. And the reason for this, and this is critical, is not because they are strong. It is because in much of their real life, they feel anything but. Many people who perform entitlement in public spaces feel remarkably powerless in private ones. They may feel invisible in their marriage, irrelevant at work, aging out of a world that used to notice them, financially stressed in ways they are too proud to admit, surrounded by people who do not quite take them seriously in the ways they believe they deserve. And so they enter a public space, a store, a restaurant, an airport, and they find the one person in the room who is institutionally prevented from dismissing them. And in that interaction, they take back everything the rest of their life refuses to give them. This is what psychologists sometimes call displaced powerlessness. The helplessness they feel in one domain of life gets transferred with enormous force onto someone who happens to be standing in front of them with a name tag and a company policy. It is not really about the parking ticket. It is not really about the table reservation. It is about a person who feels small trying, in the only arena available to them, to feel big. Chapter 4. Rules feel like humiliation. Now let's go deeper into why small rules can produce such enormous reactions. Because from the outside, these outbursts look wildly disproportionate. A grown adult, sometimes screaming, sometimes in tears, sometimes threatening legal action, over a coupon, over a return window, over a seating chart. It does not make sense unless you understand what is actually happening inside that person's emotional world. For people with a fragile ego, and that phrase is important, so let's sit with it, self-worth is not an internal, stable thing. It is maintained by external validation, by being treated as special, by having their preferences respected, their exceptions granted, their importance acknowledged. Their self-image is essentially a balloon, and every interaction either inflates it or punctures it. Ma'am, you need to wait your turn. Puncture. I'm sorry, we cannot honor this expired coupon. Puncture. The kitchen is already closed for the night. Puncture. To someone with a secure sense of self, these are just neutral statements of fact. Minor inconveniences at worst. You process them and move on. But to the person whose entire sense of worth depends on being treated as the exception, being told no is not a practical inconvenience. It is an emotional exposure. Being corrected in public feels like being shamed in public. Being treated like everyone else feels like being reduced, like being seen as less than what they know themselves to be. And the rage that follows? That is not about the rule. That is about the humiliation of being ordinary. Chapter 5. The victim costume. And then something remarkable happens, because you might expect that someone who breaks a rule and is then held to that rule would feel some version of guilt, or at least embarrassment, but watch what often happens instead. The person who parks in a handicapped space without a permit and gets a ticket does not feel remorse. They feel wronged. The person who shouts at a cashier and is asked to lower their voice does not feel embarrassed. They feel attacked. The person who ignores a clearly posted policy and then gets denied does not feel accountable. They feel discriminated against. I have never been treated so badly in my life. I know my rights. I want to speak to your manager. You are going to regret this. I am going to make sure you lose your job. Watch the psychological flip that is happening in real time. The person who caused the disruption has now positioned themselves as the victim of it. They have moved in their own mind from offender to wronged party. And that shift is not accidental. It is a psychological mechanism. Because victimhood, in these situations, is a source of moral power. Once you see yourself as the wronged party, you are no longer accountable for your behavior. You are justified by it. Every cruelty you deliver is now an act of self-defense. Every demand is now a matter of principle. Every escalation is now righteous. This is what moral licensing looks like at its most revealing. The story they tell themselves, I am the one being mistreated here, gives them permission to be as cruel, as loud, as threatening as they want to be. Because in their narrative, they are the hero. And this is one of the most psychologically seductive aspects of entitlement. It does not feel like selfishness. It feels like courage. Chapter 6. The addiction to escalation. Now, you might wonder, why does it so rarely end? Why does it get bigger instead of smaller? A normal person, when they encounter a problem, wants it resolved. They want the outcome. The refund, the table, the parking space, the exception. But watch what happens with the entitled personality when the initial demand is denied. Do they leave? Do they try somewhere else? Do they accept the answer? They escalate. Almost always, they escalate. Ask for the manager, film the employee on their phone, threaten a review, threaten corporate, make the scene larger, louder, more dramatic, more public. And here is what that tells us. They are no longer solving a problem. They are fighting an emotional courtroom. Escalation gives them something the original interaction denied them: the feeling of power, the feeling of control. The larger the conflict becomes, the more important they feel inside it. The more witnesses there are, the more the performance means. Because at this point, the conflict is no longer about the coupon. It stopped being about that somewhere around the second sentence. Now it is about something much bigger and much more personal. It is about restoring the wounded sense of status that was injured the moment someone said no. And in that emotional courtroom, winning is not getting the refund. Winning is making the employee feel as small as they themselves felt when the rule was enforced. Chapter 7. The Public Performance of Superiority. There is one more thing that almost every one of these incidents has in common, and it is something that gets overlooked entirely in most conversations about this kind of behavior. They want an audience. Not every time, but often enough that it is worth examining. Because these confrontations rarely happen quietly. They rarely happen in a whisper. They happen at a volume that ensures the surrounding room hears every word. Notice the language that comes out in these moments. It is formal, even when it is furious. I have been a loyal customer for 17 years. Do you have any idea who you are speaking with? This is completely unacceptable, and I am going to report this to the highest level of your organization. This is not the language of someone trying to solve a practical problem. This is the language of someone performing, playing a role, auditioning in real time for the part of the wronged, intelligent, morally superior person who has been failed by incompetence. They want the people around them to watch and think, she knows what she deserves. She is not going to be pushed around. She is important enough to fight back. This is status performance, and it requires witnesses, which is why the volume goes up, not down, which is why the threats become more elaborate, not simpler. Because the performance has an audience to play to, and the audience is the point. Chapter 8. Why service workers become the target. This brings us to an important question. Why is this behavior so concentrated in specific environments? Restaurants, retail stores, hotels, airports, customer service calls. And the answer is not complicated, though it is deeply uncomfortable. Service environments are uniquely designed arenas for this kind of person, because the power dynamics inside them are unlike almost anywhere else in adult life. In most adult contexts, if someone treats you badly, you can walk away. You can speak back. You can end the interaction. The cashier cannot walk away. The waiter cannot snap back. The receptionist must keep smiling. The gate agent is required, by their employment, to maintain a professional tone while someone accuses them of ruining their vacation. The customer service representative must say, "I understand your frustration," to someone who is calling them names. The entitled person senses this imbalance intuitively, even if they never consciously name it. They know, somewhere beneath the surface, that the person in front of them is trapped by professionalism, that there will be no real consequence for their behavior, that the employee must absorb whatever comes. And for someone who needs to feel powerful without risking genuine conflict, customer service environments are a temporary kingdom. Power without accountability, as history has demonstrated in every domain imaginable, has a way of revealing exactly who someone really is. Not who they pretend to be in the places where people can push back, but who they actually are when there is no cost for cruelty. Chapter 9. The Childhood Roots. When no was never learned properly. Let's take a step back now, because this is where the psychology gets genuinely complex. Because nobody is born this way. Some of these individuals grew up in households where their emotional discomfort was treated as an emergency, where their frustration became everyone else's problem to fix, where the word no was so rarely heard, or so immediately reversed when they pushed back, that they never developed the emotional vocabulary to process disappointment without turning it into a crisis. Others came from the opposite experience. Homes where they were emotionally neglected, where their needs went unheard for so long that the only thing that ever worked was making noise, being loud, demanding loudly. and they carried that strategy into adulthood like a survival tool that no longer fits the life they are living. And still others grew up in environments where dominance was the primary emotional currency, where the person who pushed hardest was the person who got what they needed, where kindness was something that happened to you only after you proved you could not be ignored. None of this is an excuse. I want to be very clear about that. Understanding the origin of a behavior does not absolve someone of the responsibility to change it. Adults with difficult childhoods can and do learn to regulate themselves, to sit with disappointment, to accept limits without making those limits someone else's punishment. But origins matter because they reveal what this behavior actually is. At its core, this is not arrogance. It is a failure of emotional development. A person who never properly learned to tolerate the feeling of being told no. And every time they rage at a cashier, they are, in the most painfully literal sense, throwing a very adult version of a childhood tantrum. Chapter 10. The Emotional Age of a Tantrum. Which brings us to something worth looking at directly, because it reframes the entire behavior in a way that is both more accurate and, honestly, more sobering. A toddler screams when the world refuses to match their desire, when the cookie is taken away, when the toy belongs to someone else, when bedtime is non-negotiable. The screaming is not manipulation exactly. It is a developmental stage. The child has not yet learned that other people's needs exist, that boundaries are not betrayals, that discomfort is survivable. Now picture someone in a department store, someone who is 53 years old, professionally dressed, and currently saying, "You people are useless," to a 22-year-old who makes $11 an hour. This is completely unacceptable. I demand compensation. I will report every single one of you. Do you understand who you are talking to? The vocabulary is adult. The threats are adult. The social power is adult. But the emotional age of what is happening, that is the same thing as the child on the floor of the grocery store who did not get the sugary cereal. Psychologists sometimes call this emotional regression. Under stress, real stress, perceived stress, the stress of being told that the kitchen is closed, certain people fall back into an earlier emotional state. A state where anger is not a signal to communicate. It is a tool to force compliance, to make the discomfort stop, to make the world do what you need it to do. The tantrum is the same. The scale is just larger. Chapter 11. The dangerous part. When entitlement meets authority. And now we have to get serious for a moment, because everything we have talked about so far, the ego injuries, the status performance, the displaced powerlessness, has mostly been uncomfortable to watch. Embarrassing. Difficult for the workers involved, obviously, but manageable. However, there is a version of this that stops being merely embarrassing and starts being genuinely dangerous, because some people who operate from this framework of entitlement do not just make scenes. They weaponize systems. They call the police over a parking dispute and describe the other person in terms designed to maximize the police response. They file formal complaints that they know are false, but that they also know will require weeks of investigation to dismiss. They use their social position, their race, their economic class, their connections to threaten people's livelihoods when those people did nothing except enforce a rule. They make accusations that can follow someone for years. They exploit the gap between their social credibility and someone else's vulnerability. This is not just a bad customer. This is entitlement weaponized. And the people most often harmed by it are those who were already in the most precarious positions. And here is the deeply troubling part. In these moments, the person doing the harm almost always believes they are the victim. They are not lying about that belief. They have constructed a story so complete, so emotionally satisfying, that they have cast themselves as the hero, as the person bravely standing up for what is right, as the one who finally said something. When entitlement combines with perceived moral superiority, it stops being a character flaw and starts being a force that can hurt real people in real ways. That is where the analysis has to stop being empathetic and start being direct. This is behavior that causes harm, and the psychological origins of that harm do not make it less real for the people on the receiving end. Chapter 12. How to deal with this kind of person. So what do you do if you encounter one of these individuals? Whether you are a service worker, a manager, a bystander, or just someone who has the misfortune of being standing near the customer service counter at the wrong moment? The first principle, and arguably the most important, is this: do not match their emotional temperature. When someone escalates, the instinct, for people who are reasonable, empathetic, wired for social harmony, is to either match their energy in defensiveness or to over-explain, to reason, to appeal to their sense of fairness. Neither of these works. Over-explanation gives them new things to argue about. Defensiveness confirms the story they are already telling themselves. Keep your language short, calm, and repeatable. Not robotic, not cold, but consistent. I understand you are upset. The policy is the same. And then, again, if needed, the policy is the same. Not louder. Not with elaboration. The same. Offer choices, not debates. These are the two options available to you right now. Full stop. The moment you expand beyond that into reasoning and context, you have opened a negotiation that they will take as an invitation to keep arguing. Stay attached to the rule, not to the emotion in the room. Because the emotion in the room is very loud and very designed, even if not consciously, to pull you away from the boundary, to make the boundary feel cruel, to make holding it feel like you are the one being unreasonable. Do not try to make them understand your humanity in the middle of their performance. That is a conversation for a different kind of moment. In this moment, they are not capable of receiving it. And when necessary, when the behavior crosses into genuine harassment, into threats, into anything that makes the environment unsafe, document it. Remove yourself from it. Involve someone with the authority to end the interaction. You are not obligated to absorb cruelty to demonstrate your professionalism. That is a line worth holding. Chapter 13. The final psychological truth. And so we arrive at the bottom of this. Underneath all the escalation and the performance and the demands for managers and the threats and the victim costumes and the noise, underneath all of that is a person fighting a hidden war. A war against ordinariness. A war against powerlessness. Quiet fear that they are not actually more significant than anyone else. And the tragedy is that the war cannot be won this way. No amount of managers summoned, no volume of escalation will ever fill the actual hole. Because the hole is not in the return policy. It is not in the parking rule or the restaurant's closing time. The hole is in the person, and it was there long before they walked through the door. Rules are not always oppression. Sometimes they are just how we organize shared space. Being told no is not always humiliation. Sometimes it is simply a Tuesday. Waiting your turn is not an attack on your identity. It is just the line. If you have made it this far, I want to hear from you. Drop your experience in the comments. I want to read the most unbelievable moment you have ever witnessed. And if this video helped you, please like it and share it with someone who needs to see it. Subscribe if you want more psychology content that goes deeper than the surface.